Hi, I'm John Desjarlais, the Executive Director of the Indigenous Resource Network, and welcome to our Indigenous Voices podcast. So today we're joined by Amanda Robert, who is the Senior Advisor, Indigenous and Community Relations with Suncor, proud member of our network, and is going to share an exciting story today. So thank you, Amanda, for joining us.
Thank you.
Awesome.
I don't know about exciting, but
I'll
try to make it exciting.
I've been excited all morning, excited to have this conversation. And, but yeah, like, so, you know, when we do these things, one other thing that's important, we introduce ourselves, stuff like that. But, you know, again, we spoke a lot about this in our previous conversations, but the relational aspect. So again, similar on our podcast. Tell us a little bit about yourself, your ties, your communal, your kinship ties, where you're from, a little background, you know, less the position, more the person.
Sure. So my family comes from Manitoba, southern Manitoba. So just with those facts, you can probably guess that I'm Métis. I have ties into North Dakota as well with the Turtle Mountain Chippewa Band further back. But mostly, you know, the part that we celebrate and the part of that became myself of the culture is Métis. 90% of my family comes from that Pembina River area. So my mom moved out here before I was born, though, out to Alberta. So I grew up in Alberta born and bred. Go home as often as we can to visit some of the aunties and the cousins. They're still in the communities in North Dakota. So that's a little bit about like where my family's from. I grew up in Alberta. I left home at a very young age. You know, you want to get talking into the logistical challenges of being Indigenous and some of that intergenerational trauma, and it's all in there. You know, I left home very young, and you know, I buggered off to Australia for a few years, just being a little wild child, and came home. I worked with cattle and horses, and I was just a feral thing. And like we were talking about before we started filming, you know, I left school early. I think I went to the first grade first day of grade 10, and then I bounced. You know, I had horses to ride and things to do, and not long after that I was in Australia. So a lot of what I like to share with the youth, just tied into that, is just about, you know, if you don't finish high school, it's not the end of the world, honestly. And at the time it feels like it. You feel like a failure. You feel like all your friends are in university, you know, and what are you doing? And I came home a few years later from Australia. I wrote my GED. I got into the trades. I became a heavy-duty mechanic in mining. And from there, I mean, long story short, I sort of evolved through that. I had some good mentors. I had some good people in my life, a lot of growth, you know, that's just self-directed because there's no other way that it can really happen. And now I sit here in downtown Calgary. So it's been a journey for sure. I mean, me on horseback 20 years ago would not have believed this would be me here today. Been a lot of different lives in 40-something years, not to age myself.
that's incredible. Like one of the, you know, I remember speaking to a good friend, and they were talking about, you know, how, you know, 20-year-old self would be so disappointed with what 35-year-old self is doing right now. And they said, "What about you?" And I was like, "I don't know. I think 18-year-old self would be shocked as to what 22-year-old self what they were doing. 22-year-old self would never believe what 25-year-old self was doing." And I was like, so I never really, I don't know, and so I don't know if I could ever be truly disappointed because the life takes you in incredible places. But one of the things I think this is so awesome and worthwhile talking about is, you know, and then we talked about this earlier, following forward, but I think this idea of success and failure, and, you know, what does success look like? What does society expect us it to look like and to perform to? And how we're so hard on ourselves when we don't do something that we think is viewed as success, right?
What you should be doing at that age.
What we should be doing at that age. And one of the things I love talking to youth about is, first in my presentations is like I ask what they're all doing and what they want to do, because I'm still looking for ideas in terms of how I want to, you know, what I want to do when I grow up and how I want to live my life. And so, but that's great. Like let's talk a little bit more about that. You know, we are really unfair as a society to, especially to youth and to Indigenous youth, because we say this is, you know, because we want them to be better, right? Yes. But then at the same time, we don't give them, I think we're not sensitive and compassionate enough when they make those big mistakes. How could we do that more often?
I think, first of all, Indigenous youth, especially now, are under a tremendous amount of pressure.
Mm-hmm.
You're the new hope, you're the next generation, you're going to fix 600 years of trauma and colonization, and it's all on you. Mm-hmm. No pressure.
Yeah.
So I think those kids are feeling that, and if they do slide backwards a little bit, if they do drop out of high school, or they whatever it might be, they feel like they've failed not only themselves but their whole ancestry, and all that pressure that's been put on them and expectation. I think that it makes it harder. It's one of the factors that does play into things, and that's why I 10, 15 years ago, I never would have told anybody that I dropped out of high school. And now I use it as motivation for others to realize that that's not the end of the road. You know, it doesn't mean you failed.
Yeah.
I know people that went to university for years at hundreds of thousands of dollars, and they're not even doing what they went to school for, right?
Yeah.
So it's, but you're right, there's this expectation. You're going to finish high school, you're going to go to university, you're going to get a degree, you're going to get married and have 2.5 children and be a contributing member of society, and a little dog or something. Yeah. So it's, the problem with that is that everybody grows differently, For myself, if I had finished school and even had money to go to university, never mind, I probably wouldn't be anywhere near the person I am now. I wouldn't have the depth of experience I have now to do the job that I'm doing now. So where would I be? Who knows? And, it's such a fluid thing. You can't put someone in a box, especially when we get talking Indigenous versus Western world expectations of the youth. It's completely different, coming from completely different backgrounds most of the time. Different levels of privilege for sure. It's just not fair to use the same measuring stick on everybody. It's some people, you're 40 and you go to university and completely change your career. But that's the thing I like to preach a lot, because I was a mechanic, and I love being in these corporate spaces coaching CEOs and being like, so when I was a heavy-duty mechanic, and they're like, okay. So it's everybody's education level is going to look like something different, and that lived experience versus the degree, sometimes that's more valuable depending on what direction you go in. So I think a lot of that pressure is part of it. And then that setting those expectations of having ABC by the time you're 30, it's not realistic for anyone. And there's just, you can go about it in so many different ways. And I speak from experience on that. I mean, like you say, at 16, when I took off to Australia, if you'd be like, oh, you're going to come home and you're going to work downtown and wear fancy blazers, and it's not something I would have believed. So life changes so drastically in ways you least expect for the best. But I like interacting with the youth for that reason, because they have this idea of what success looks like, and it often involves checking those boxes, but it's not the same for everybody.
No,
a lot of different paths to the same place.
Totally. Like one of the things, a lot of people, and I talk about it much more openly because I attribute what success I think I've had to it. But I've failed courses, I've failed classes, I've had a lot of failures, personally and professionally. And again, it's how you build yourself up. Not letting those things define you, but how you build yourself up from those. Sounds like a cliche, but it is so true. And then that's why I'm glad to hear it from you. And then it's so important that, again, another cliche is if you truly follow something that means something to you and you enjoy doing it, that's really all that matters.
That's right.
And so, and then, I'm less about, materialistic things and material wealth, and more about kind of a more of a general idea of wealth and well-being, right? And so back home, Minamimatsu and the good life and Cree, and talk about that kind of holistic well-being. But I think that's a really important lesson. And youth they're in a really special but complicated time where there's almost a resurgence, or even if it's just a surgence of self-determination. They're just so excited, but at the same time there's all these ideas of what they should be, but yet they're discovering who they are as Indigenous people and youth, and then starting to carve and shape all these new things. But at the same time, you're probably gonna hit the ground hard in a lot of these endeavors.
It's life, and you're right. It's a new thing to be proud to be Indigenous. Let's face it. Even our parents, at our generation, the younger generation, it wasn't always something you advertised. It wasn't always something you celebrated. A lot of times it was repressed. It was hidden. You know, we were just talking about that earlier about, you know, white passing Indigenous people and influence versus, you know, how Native can you be and still be accepted. But to be proud to be Indigenous and have that self-determination and push around in those spaces for recognition of that, that's a very new thing. So there's one more thing we're putting on the youth, you know, to carry. Although, you know, it's something they carry happily and with pride, it's still one more thing. And there's all these firsts, you know. Every time I hear the youth speak, we have a youth advisory council with our company. Every time I hear them speak, I'm blown away. You know, speaking of our younger selves, when I was 20, there's no way that I had that much, you know, decorum and I had that well-spoken. And they are so adept at being between traditional life and modern life. You know, they're in university and they're speaking traditional languages, and they really are going to be the hope. They're the beginning of the 7 generations of change for the better, in my mind, because many of the university age students, that's the first generation that wasn't in residential school. Really. So there's a lot on them, you know, but they're doing it and in different ways. It doesn't have to look the same for each of them.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, and we should absolutely celebrate that. You know, one thing you mentioned it, I find this so fascinating. You know, and so there's that intersectionality, of course, of, you know, being a woman, being Indigenous, and working in industrial sites, working in resource development, and of course, you know, and then there's that, you know, non-traditional or whatever you want to call it, the path of pursuing a trade certificate, right, in an underrepresented field. So there's all these kind of, you know, things that said people like you know, people don't choose paths like this, right? But I think you spoke to it that, you know, the path you know, moved into a lot of these different opportunities you pursue. But yeah, let's speak to, I'd love to know, you know, what were some of the challenges with a path like that?
There were a few, if you can imagine.
Yes.
Like you say, and you know what, I'm not proud to admit that I didn't advertise that I was Indigenous, because I am white passing, and that did make my life easier. And you know, lessons learned in a younger life, but you're already ostracized to a point for being female. You know, you're already kind of on the outside. You hear the way people speak, especially in the trades and things. There's a lot of racism. There's a lot of single-mindedness. Very dominant demographics of, you know, young white men in the trades in the oil field, and you know, I didn't feel like I needed to give them another reason to sort of set me out of the group. So I am guilty of that, you know, and I hope I'm making up for it now as I get older. But it wasn't easy, you know, through school and things. You had different people, different players in your life, right? You have the critics, and we talked about this earlier too, that sometimes that's motivation, right? And you have the supporters, you have people you'll never forget, because they were the only ones that were nice to you, you know. But it has been challenging. You know, everything from those attitudes that you're trying to change to trying to keep your mouth shut when people say ignorant things, and you don't want to cause a scene, and you don't, you know, you're trying to fit in, and all this stuff I think a lot of people struggle with through growing up Indigenous. And being white passing, as I know I am, it's almost double down, because then when you do step up and speak about your heritage or have some pride or defend something, it's like, well, you don't look like an Indian, you know. And then you have to defend that on top of everything else, right? So it's fraught with challenge. But you know, I was lucky. The company that I was working at before I sort of transitioned into a professional corporate sort of role, they had an Indigenous employee network, have an Indigenous employee network, and that was really key to sort of finding that pride and having others like you, even though they're not on the shop floor with you, but it was an inclusive sort of thing, and I know that's exactly the intention of it. And honestly, I don't know if I'd work anywhere that doesn't have one now, because I look at the youth just entering the workforce, people coming from remote communities, whether it's a site or downtown here or in the trades. It's so different and so intimidating, never mind being female, but just being, you're of a different culture, right? And we need that support, whether it's a employee network or it's a buddy program, or I just think it's really important to have that. Like for myself, that's sort of what started to turn everything for me, honestly. I got involved in that network, I met other Indigenous people, I started going out in communities, just really found that sense of pride, and then started to platform it, you know, and through that, my whole career path has changed. So that's what I mean, like it's funny how things tie together looking back, but a lot of challenges. You know, you're living in camp, you're flying in and out.
Yeah.
You want to talk your home, work-life balance, all these things, and you know. And the other thing we talked about is, like, we talk about retention and recruitment and promotion. And when you look around, most of the Indigenous people you see are at entry level. You know, they're laborers, they're cleaners, they're tradesmen or equipment operators. And as we move up, and here in corporate, I don't see a lot of people that look like me in leadership.
Yeah.
My good friend Lana says something, I have to give her credit, because she says this, I don't want to steal it from her. Lana says, and she's Indigenous as well, you can't be what you can't see.
Yeah.
So by setting that example now in my sunset years, we'll call it, I'm so old, the young people to see, we are so old, John, to see Indigenous people in leadership positions, you know, setting an example, making change, having that impact and that influence, that helps too, because it doesn't feel so hopeless. You know, you see that they're listening. Indigenous people have more of a voice now than they ever did, and that's not going to go away. And you know, that's where I want to see more in leadership. I want to see that dynamic change where, you know, why are we not promoting more Indigenous youth into positions? Why are we not fostering, you know, these transitions for people in their careers, and understanding that lived knowledge and Western scientists and Indigenous scientists, you don't always need that piece of paper or degree to show that you have that depth of knowledge to be part of, you know, an advisory council, or part of, you know, certain things you do need a degree for, let's be real, but I'm going to be a doctor.
Arguably,
a neurosurgeon. But I just really think that that's part of, you know, when we talk about recruitment and we talk about hiring and we talk about support, you need to look beyond the paper label, because there's so much more depth to life's experience and to who that might be. Are they, you know, can you grow this person? Is there potential there? And just recognizing there's different levels and different ways that people are going to develop, you know, instead of looking for the fully finished product. You know, and there is Indigenous people out there that are. But for me, I want to live to see more Indigenous leadership in these corporations, especially in oil and gas. I want to see more equity partnerships. I want to see more voices heard, not just changing the garbage or shoveling up around, you know. And that's where it motivates me, because it just seems like you get pigeonholed, you know, and we want our people to succeed. We want our people to grow, and corporations have a little bit of a responsibility to foster that, in my mind.
Yeah, they absolutely do. Like, you know, there's a lot there, but you know, I think some things, some of the highlights that really resonate for me is that, you know, representation matters. It absolutely matters. I know, like, as a young person, identification relation. If you can't see yourself in an organization, it's really tough to think that there's an opportunity for you.
Exactly.
And I remember I was at this conversation one time, you know, with a senior leader of another organization, and I talked about, you know, it really matters. I don't see too many people that, you know, that are like me in your organization. And I remember them laughing, and I said, no, there's another really big guy that works down the. I was like, I'm not talking about big guys. He's like, oh, okay. It's like, yeah. I said, he's like, oh, but I mean, you know, representation absolutely truly matters. And the other part to that is, you know, I think this is where, you know, I think more people need to understand is that it's, you know, we get challenged with advocating for that because it's seen as self-serving, but it's not. It comes from a place of service, and it comes from a place of you know, a different idea of wealth and benefit. And so, like in your career in particular, it's really wonderful and interesting to see it transition more towards service. You know, in terms of your impact as it extends out. And I find that happens with a lot of Indigenous people. As they become comfortable in the things that they do and they enjoy doing, they're compelled to start to, again, make a difference much bigger than themselves. And we advocate for this type of representation because we want to see organizations and corporations that are representative of, you know, our communities, and that includes Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. And it's not about creating more opportunities for ourselves, because that's that really Western corporate ideology, right? And so if we're asking for something, I need to benefit. No, I don't need to benefit at all. It's not about that. It's about what is fair and equitable and meaningful and builds a healthier society, right? And so,
absolutely,
really love that point that you mentioned about that. I have some questions here that. Okay. We like to mix it up a little bit. Let's call this rapid fire.
Oh boy!
I know, right? I know. And so one of the things, and we talked about like some of the work and trenches, and and starting grassroots, and now we're doing different things, and that's really important. But the other thing is, IRN talks quite often about good, and we like to see and advocate for good, but. And then people ask us, so, what informs your perspective of good? Well, it's conversations like these. I like to believe myself as a steward in a lot of different capacities, but it's also a steward of that very important and, received knowledge that people share and discuss with us, right? And so this is, again, a good example of that. So we talk about good Indigenous involvement in the resource industry. So what does good look like? And give yourself, 30 seconds to a minute. I know it's a tall order.
No pressure.
Yeah, no pressure. So what does good look like in recruitment in the resource sector?
Well, like I mentioned, for me, it's not taking someone's resume at face value. Mm-hmm. Looking deeper than just what's on paper. Giving somebody a little bit more of a chance, and just like, okay, you didn't meet the 5 check boxes that we had in mind. Yeah. I haven't even spoken to you out. Recruitment is getting out there, having that presence in the communities to let them know what we're about, yeah. Or whoever you are, what yeah. you're about. Yeah. I'm finding a lot with the youth right now, and I'm probably going to go over time, that that's okay. Yeah. They want to work for somewhere they can feel good about working at. You have to have a good reputation in the community as a company. Mm-hmm. You have to have good relationship. You have to be doing some of the right things, or they're not even interested in being part of it. So there's a challenge there too, where we have a little bit of a job in that too. Yeah. In recruiting, to make ourselves attractive to these young people, mm-hmm. To bring in more Indigenous people, and that's through things like inclusion, and like I mentioned for myself, having a network or having a support system, mm-hmm. And really just getting out there and getting to know people before you disregard what you may think is not suitable. Mm-hmm. There's so much potential in the Indigenous youth that mm-hmm. it's important to look past what you think is on your checklist. Have a little bit more of an open mind. Keep in mind you can grow people. Keep in mind you can mentor people. Yeah. For myself, though, when I think about recruitment, we also have a responsibility to be a good place to work. Yeah, absolutely. And so then once we get people to join our organization, what does good look like in terms of retaining that talent? That's important. You want to see people around you that are like you, right? You don't want to feel like that dreaded diversity hire, the dreaded token Indian, that can be tough. Yeah. Retention, a lot of people go to site for a week and they disappear, because it's intimidating. You're living in a camp, you're living very regimented, you're in a tiny little room. That can be triggering for people for different reasons. If you've been in residential school, if you've been in a facility of some kind, it's very hard. Everything's very scheduled. You're in a little tiny room. Yeah. And you're isolated, you're away from home. People struggle for different reasons away from home in camp. That's a difficult one, and without understanding why. We did establish some smudge spaces at site for people to be able to pray. Mm-hmm. That was a big one. They're told, go to the smoke pit to smudge. Mm-hmm. I don't think anyone with any kind of belief system would want to pray in a smoke pit. It's a little bit of, the energy's off a bit.
I think so.
Especially on site. But little things like that, like recognizing significant events throughout the year, having the support there, having that network of other Indigenous people to help you out, having resources. All of those things matter for retention, feeling like you're seen and heard, feeling like you're respected, feeling like you have a future in the company and you're not just going to be stuck at this level forever. And that's part of that whole, you can't be what you can't see, because say you're a laborer and you've been a laborer for 10 years and you've been passed over for promotion so many times, people will probably leave, or even at different levels. If we're not doing the right thing as a company and as a corporation, you want your Indigenous employees to go out there and sell something they themselves don't believe in, they're probably going to leave eventually. So retention it's a broadband, you know, you have to, again, I point back at the corporation itself to have some responsibility in listening to what Indigenous people are saying and incorporating that into your practice. Make it somewhere you want to work and you want to grow. Have spaces like where we're sitting right now, or if you want to go and have a smudge and a prayer, you just go and do that. You know, you have the privacy, you have a space away from the corporate sort of grind to sit and be pensive for a minute, you know, and hold space for things and not just try not to westernize it all, you know. It's very hard in corporate myself, I've noticed the most. Everything from not seeing myself represented in the people walking around to the way things are done, to the way the hierarchy is and everything. It's very challenging, but to retain people, I think you have to make them feel like they're seen here, that I see pieces of myself around here. I see that I'm seen and respected and that I'm heard, and that's and that there's room to grow. I think that's a big one as well.
And then they could see those growth opportunities, right?
Yes.
That's incredibly important. I think, like as organizations become more inclusive, not just for Indigenous people, but you know, for all, I guess, marginalized groups, it's really important to see yourselves in organizations. It's really important to know you can move around in organizations, right? And so representation across the organizations matters as well too, because it demonstrates that growth, and there's got to be good training opportunities. So
that fostering, and we keep coming back to that, but I guess it's because it's important and it's true.
It is.
Representation does matter, and like we talked about consultation and indigenizing spaces and all this, but consultation is one thing, but actually enabling what you get from that and putting it into practice, that's a completely different story. Now, you know, you need to take what is given for information and integrate that, or don't ask, because if you have no intention of enabling that and activating it, then it's even more defeating for the people that gave the input or were part of that to see that it went nowhere. You know,
and imagine trying to get that again, right?
And you won't get the same audience. You're right. And with community or with employees, I think it's the same sort of scenario, right? You're not going to sit down and give your time and your advice and your thoughts. If they're thrown away, that tells you how important it is, right? So it's there's that whole consultation and listening thing and ties together, you know.
Absolutely. And then, you know, we talked quite a bit about this before, but you know, I think that relationship between, well, the relation side of, you know, being performative and transactional and process driven versus, you know, what's the intent, the spirit intent of what I'm trying to do here, right? And if it is just business, that'll manifest. And it'll reflect your relationships and your challenges, your business challenges. But if it's truly relational, that'll manifest as well too. You will see allyship, right, and influencing a lot of those things.
And there has to be a balance. Obviously, business is business. But if you're only showing up when you want something, you know, it's like that friend that only calls you when they need help moving and they've got pizza and cheap beer. And the older we get, the less likely we are to do that. But you know, you need to. Cheap beer. I got heavy stuff.
I still work for pizza and cheap beer, but I get you.
I'll call you. But it's the same, like you say. It's this transactional relationship. That's old news. You need to have a relationship that's respected, that's honored. You have to have a reputation, and not just where we're making the money. You know, I think it's important to just out of morality and out of the right thing to do, and out of, you know, if you really mean what you say about reconciliation as a person, as a company, you need to maintain and establish those relationships because it's the right thing to do. Not just because you have an agreement to honor a legality you need to mind, and that, again, consultation falls in that same category. You know, don't do it because you have to. You know, we're doing it because it's the right thing to do, and that's one of the calls to action. It's part of the way we're going to move forward as a society, is recognizing that those relationships are important, not just because you have business associated with, you know, don't just show up when you want something. So you're right,
and communities can feel that, right?
Oh, absolutely, they can, yes.
Business development, and so we, you know, talk to a lot of businesses and things like that, and built by a lot of entrepreneurs. The Indigenous Resource Network is very, very interested in kind of understanding the deeper, more collective experience. But what does good look like from a business development or a, you know, from a procurement or a supply side, Indigenous business? What does good look like?
I think I'm going over my 30 seconds every time.
That's okay. That's okay. Yeah.
I feel like
extended rapid fire.
Yes.
That's okay.
And this is just my opinion, of course, but I feel like, again, it's sort of like the same thing as the resume thing when you're recruiting. You know, when you're looking at an Indigenous business, you're looking at bids, you're looking at contracts. Of course, you know, someone's not going to be able to compete with the big box store without naming any names, you know. You have to recognize that we can give a little bit of an opportunity, you know, that we can grow this. They may be just as good, but not as well known. You know, they may be just as good, but not as big. But there's that bit of that recognition matters, because if you're just going to take the big guy that's been on all these jobs and the bid is, you know, maybe comparable, you're not helping anybody grow, you know, and if you truly, economic reconciliation is part of the strategy and part of what we're doing, again, similar to recruitment, you have to look at these bids and these businesses as potential. You know, yes, they can do what you're asking them to do. And you have to look at it as an opportunity to grow. It's a partnership. You know, it's mutually beneficial. But don't write them off at face value because you've never heard of them, or because they're smaller, or because they've only existed 5 years. You know, you have to take into consideration the difference in level set, the difference in privilege, the difference in everything, right? And like I say, not to name names, but I'm sure you can think of a big corporation that gets a lot of contracts on sites or whatnot. But and for me, this isn't my area of specialty. It's just what I think about it is the same sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? Grant a little bit of grace in that way, and understanding that a lot of people, we're just coming out of all this, all these things that have happened, all these multiple generations of complete repression, and people are just starting to learn what it is to be successful as Indigenous people, to be, you know, have that self-determination of success. You're not working for someone else. You know, we have a role to play in helping to grow those businesses and enable those people to, you know, to grow their own business. And I don't know if that's the right way to say it, but
no, that's an incredibly well way to say it. You know, I've been an Indigenous entrepreneur. I've been a contractor, and you know, and you know, I've spoken on policy, and I've spoken on a lot of different things. But you're absolutely right. Like, you know, and then even trying to pivot the conversation is to redefine what value. We get evaluated to price. How could an Indigenous business ever compete against someone who has been operating for 20 or 30 years, right?
Exactly.
And so the only way is to eat, work. And I remember being told by proponents saying, well, if that's what it takes for you to grow your business, that's you. And then I remember saying, that's actually the opposite of reconciliation. That's capitalism. And you're actually taking advantage of the situation. I didn't get that contract, but I mean, I had to speak my values and my truth. And
but I bet they didn't forget you.
And I'm sure they didn't. I'm sure they didn't. And I thought, this is the issue with procurement and supply chain development. It's about serving the interests of the organization. How do you reconcile that with your Truth and Reconciliation Action Plan, or your Indigenous engagement, or your supplier business development? And so then I thought, okay, you know, if organizations still want to do the good, then let's build a business case as to why they need to do this, and redefine value and, you know, local impact and everything like that. But you're right, deeper understanding, level the playing field, afford these businesses, you know, the dignity and the opportunity to grow into that space where they can deliver value that might be higher than some of your traditional suppliers. But again, I love that understanding.
Sounds better when you say it, I think, than when I said it.
No.
And it's not apples to apples, right? You have to have someone in those positions making those decisions that has the cultural competency to recognize exactly what we're saying, right?
Yeah. There's nothing worse as an Indigenous business. There's nothing worse than to engage when organizations say, we have an Indigenous procurement policy, but yet there really is nothing there in terms of, well, how are you engaging me different than you engage your suppliers? We can't. Well, why do you have a policy? Why aren't we just part of the main policy?
Yeah.
And so trying to reconcile that. I remember talking.
What is the difference then?
What is the difference, right? And so what's the goal of your policy, right? And so our goal of the policy is to have a policy and not to rock the boat, right? And so it's like, people don't say that, but I'm reading between the lines there. So
exactly, yeah.
Here's
put it in writing just to be in writing, so you have it.
And it's performative, it's not relational, it speaks to all those things. We talked a lot about this, and please don't necessarily treat it as rapid fire. We might go slow, medium fire, I don't know what you call that, but
We're not going rapidly.
Yeah, we're not going rapidly enough. Yeah, exactly. Consultation and engagement. What does good look like in consultation and engagement?
Yeah, this is not a 30-second answer, John. You know that?
No, I know.
Well, I think I kind of touched on this,
Yeah.
you know, consultation and engagement. It's not a checkbox exercise, and that's cliche in itself now even to say that. But true engagement, what does true engagement look like? You know, showing up when you don't want anything, showing up for the sake of showing up, supporting the community, being there, you know, buy a turkey dinner at Christmas with no agenda attached to it. You know, show up and do Santa's Anonymous, or show up at the school and be part of a celebration. There's so many opportunities to show up and engage. I think we make the mistake often of tying it to with an agenda. You know, with we're going to engage with the community around this agreement or around this project. It's never just engaging for the sake of being supportive and showing up. I shouldn't say never, but it's not as often. And consultation's in the same sort of thread. You know, if you're going to ask and you're going to take up the time of elders and community members and council and everybody else and hold these consultation sort of meetings, you need to do something with that because it speaks volumes when you don't. And you may not get the same sort of respect to meet with you next time when you need it, or anything in the community, because again, your reputation matters, how you show up matters. If you're going to come and ask for someone's opinion, you need to somehow integrate that and think about it, and not just, okay, we asked anyway, this is what we're doing, you know. Consultation is important, but again, it's become a buzzword. I think people aren't living that as much as they need to be. It's not taken to heart, it's not enabled, and you know, it's not actioned as often as it could be. And I understand that's not always possible in business. Consultation and the answers you get through that may not be in line with what the business plan is. But you still have to sit and listen and really think on it. Not just carry on with whatever your plan was anyway. You know, it's important to take that in, take it into account and show that it means something. I've seen too many times in communities where they held consultation and they just carry on with what their plan was, and none of it's taken into account, and it's damaging to the relationship. So I don't know, engagement for me doesn't have to center around plans and projects and agreements and things. It's just truly having a relationship with a community that you maintain and you support them and show up for different events and celebrations and whatever it might be, without that caveat of it always has to be about business. I mean, that's part of it, but without the balance, you lose the relationship. Yeah,
absolutely. This one time, you know, I was providing mentorship to a senior engineering design class as an experienced industrial engineer, and I remember we were going through the process and, you know, defining the problem and identifying stakeholders and everything like that, and then, you know, and so we're going to come up with a design, we're going to engage the stakeholders, and, you know, and looked at it as a process, and it's like, how are you integrating, you know, how you engage with that group, how you integrate it into your process, into this process, into the design process. And it's like, well, we're the ones, like, you know, some of our stakeholders, they're not engineers. And I was like, what does that matter? And so, well, like, we're the experts on design, we're the experts on the technical, and it's like, are you dismissing that experience that they have, that they can bring? They might actually be able to come up with a better design than you guys can. It's like, you know, you don't know any of these things. And so I said, as you engage them as a group, they're a stakeholder, they're an important group, they have a relationship, and I said, and if you propose something and they're to operationalize that, if they were treated in that way and nothing they said was included, how successful do you think your proposal, and as you go and say, this is what we think because we're smart and everything.
Exactly.
And it was a real, I said, now take that experience, and as you go through operation, take that perspective in everything you do, in every engagement. I said, I'm Indigenous and I kind of deal with this. You know, people write us off, treat us as part of a process. Someone knows better than we do. And I was like, just treat that. And so I was trying to coach in terms of being more of a values-driven than kind of a process-driven, technical or professional. But, you know, you said it much better. It's that relational piece, right? It's about bringing in. It's about not making decisions for people. It's about affording that dignity and respect to different
and assigning
groups.
value to what your feedback is. You know, giving value to what they have to say. You know, traditional knowledge and Western knowledge, we talk about this in many spaces, you know, about comparing them. It's the same thing when we talk about reclamation, and you know, we've brought Indigenous communities and elders into reclamation efforts to talk about how do we get this to grow, or what, you know, who's going to want to use this land after we're done with it and it's reclaimed. How do we make this the best possible? And I have seen those elders outsmart the scientists with multiple degrees more than once. And that's a very important program, you know, that exists, and it needs to be, it really needs to just be common for reclamation.
Common practice, right? Right across the industry. That's awesome. We'll pivot away from the rapid fire because we're doing terrible.
We're not good at this.
We're not good at the rapid fire.
We both talk too much.
We talk too much and go too deep.
Sorry.
No apologies.
Take
that's
75.
important.
Go
take
again.
75. So that's an important aspect. There's a lot I want to talk about, and I think that's an important part. You know, how we respect and integrate into industries like, you know, the energy and the oil and gas, how we respect and integrate that local knowledge, that community involvement. But yeah, tell us a little bit more about what should be, in your mind, common practice in terms of doing that. First, there's the issue, people don't think it's done and can't see those things reconciled, and I think you give great examples of how it is. But second, what should be industry standard, industry norm in terms of, you know,
Start
reclaiming.
to finish? Oh, and reclamation.
And we'll quasi-wrap it.
How much time do you have?
Quasi-wrap it. And you know what? From a reclamation perspective,
I draw, you know, what I'm talking about with bringing the community in and bringing in the elders. Again, you got to interview Lana next, I think. But my friend Lana's the one that formed this group for Suncor specific, or for Syncrude, sorry, and brought it over to Suncor. And I think it should be common practice. It should be part of, you know what, we shouldn't be able to have an agreement without this mine closure plan integrating some part of Indigenous knowledge into how we're going to restore the land. You know, and there's everything from the scientific piece of that to like analyzing the berries right down to berries picked from an area that's never been disturbed to reclaimed area. What's the nutritional profile look like? You know, chemical analysis all the way back to, well, if we want these birds to come back, which are going to have this tree grow, which is going to bring, you know, the whole ecosystem, who better to tell you how to restore that land back to the way it was than the people that have always been there? Scientists, degrees, that's all great. But at the end of the day, that traditional knowledge and the land users are going to be the ones to determine if that land is any good when we're done with it. And I honestly believe that needs to be a part of every mine closure plan that's submitted with every you know, proposal. Every application should have something to that degree with it. Trees don't grow in straight lines in the wild, you know. We need to think about these things and start thinking about the diversity of what we're trying to create when we're gone. It's not just a patched over little piece of dirt, you know. It's got to be something that people want to use again. Trust, something people can trust to eat the berries, to hunt on that land, to eat the fish, and trust that it's going to be safe. That's another big piece of it. But this goes beyond consultation. This is direct involvement and integrating the feedback you get right into what we're doing. And like I say, I have to credit Lana for that. I can't speak of it without saying, because she deserves the credit for it. But I would love to see that legacy of that group and that idea become just standard practice across the industry. For me, it's one of the best examples that we have of integrating Indigenous knowledge into the way we do business, valuing Indigenous worldviews, all these things we talk about, we put in our policies. You know,
this is in action.
This is true enablement of that, and it's. I just love to talk about it. I'm a huge fan of it, and I mean, for me, yes, we can reclaim, but to truly put it back and to have it usable land. And often when we're dealing in areas where there is traditional land users and things like that, why not ask the people that are going to be using it and always did use it? It just makes sense.
Right? I know. And this is where I love to talk about, like, this is how that Indigenous participation within is leading that way, right? Through that thought leadership and really, you know, I think devolving from that procedural transactional aspect to really like, this is about partnership. This is about that relationship, the everlasting, sustainable. It's not about, you know, just kind of checking those boxes. But how do we include, you know, through planning, right, and from cradle to, I hate to say cradle to grave. I mean, there's better ways, right from, you know, right from the start to the end of something, so that we can, you know, things could be enjoyed in perpetuity, right? And this is where I want to celebrate that fact that, you know, great inclusion and Indigenous involvement is really innovating and helping to lead what that looks like in terms of those business relationships. So that's incredibly cool. Yeah. You know, I think along that lines, you know, how do we support that? What does good look like from a public policy, regulatory perspective? You know, how does ideas like that, how are ideas like that supported, but what does good look like from that perspective?
It's a tough one, because often what's in policy and what's intended and what's carried out are not the same thing. You know, we have all these sort of intentions and overarching statements in our policies of this is how we intend to do, this is how we will be guided by, you know, but where's the action piece of that? You know, I think we need to have things that are more measurable. Yeah. You can't measure something that's not defined. Yeah. So if you just have an idea or sort of a statement that's a little bit of a intention of how you want to go about things, that doesn't enable anything, you know, and it doesn't activate it at a ground level either. So for me, you know, the policies are good to have, but it's not quite a guideline. You know, there's no binding force to it. It's I'd like to see more measurable statements on these things that can be, you know, quantified and set down to say, okay, this, and this. You know, we say we want to increase Indigenous employees. Yeah. Okay, well, by what percentage? Yeah. And by when? Yeah. So there's the piece we're missing, right? We want to...
And accountability to
exactly.
that, right?
Measurable is accountable. So when we're just making blanket statements of like, yeah, we want to have more Indigenous employees. Yeah. You know, like what are you doing, and where are your numbers at, and how much have they grown, and what's your targets? So without setting targets and without assigning some sort of accountability to it, and to me that's measurable, you know, for something to be accomplished you have to be able to measure. Yeah. It's just a statement of intent. Yeah. And for me, policy, whether it's a regulator or internal corporate policy or whatever it might be, if you don't make that measurable, in my mind, it's no more than a statement of intent, which isn't very, it doesn't hold a lot of water.
Yeah, there's not a lot of, you know, I guess,
leaves a lot of room. Yeah.
You know, I have that's a great point. I have a lot of issue with that. You know, something we try to understand a little deeper is, like, and we talk about this, and you know, me and my board chair talked about this morning, but we're very interested in, like, tying those pieces, the measurables, the impact that we're making, and to tie business activities to, you know, those impact pieces, and what are the proxies and the measures and everything. I've been part of fantastic conversations, truly aspirational, but they stay aspirational. It's like, we need to engage, we need to figure out what actually matters to the community, right? You know, a good case in point, we talk about, you know, engagement, we talk about employment. You know, it matters a lot to the community that you have a respectable target in employment, but it also matters where those Indigenous people are. Yes. Right? That also matters a lot to us too. Because, again, our theme, one of our many themes today, is representation matters. And, you know, and then we were talking about earlier that, you know, there's incredible Indigenous thought leadership that is leading the way in terms of sustainability, sustainable practices, you know, things that are in line with those value-driven approaches to doing business that delivers business value, manages risk. And I think that's the dichotomy that Western culture really struggle with, is, you know, you can't do these values-driven things and then make money. Yes. Well, it's like, I think you're showing... It's
like you have to pick soft and fuzzy or making money.
Yeah, exactly, right? And so motherhood statements, like, no, this is actually how business is done. But one of the things I'd really love to talk about is, and we talked about this earlier, and maybe this is a little more personal, and it's personal for me, so maybe I'll go first, and I'll talk a little bit about, open it up. But, you know, I think we talk about being stewards, we talk about being sustainable, we talk about being responsible, we talk about being good, but I think sometimes the public and society struggles with these statements because they see us working in the extractive industry. And so, you know, and then we get criticized, right, as hypocrites, because how can we work in industry, in the extractive, with a footprint, and at the same time say we're all these things? Yeah. And I know as a young person I was challenged, and you know, and as I grew and developed in different industries, and first in mining and then in other industries, that was something I had to think about, and then I was like, I didn't feel like I was compromising. I didn't feel, and then I chose professions and I chose opportunities that were in line with what were important to me. But I thought right away, and, through great influences, I thought, if I want to change anything, if I want to make an impact, I'm not going to be doing it outside with a picket. I'm going to be doing it inside. I'm going to, people are going to start to hopefully respect my point of view, recognize and appreciate my values and my value-driven approach. I'm going to be able to change the way things are done that are better in line with my values. If they need changing, and I'm going to do a lot of this from what's inside. And I was very successful at it and did it without a lot of rhetoric, a lot of flash, and you just make meaningful change. You change the way people see things and do things, and you believe you're making a lasting impact. So again, it's a very challenging question, and it's one that we get criticized with often. But if you don't mind, tell me a little bit about what it's like being, an Indigenous woman, and we talk a lot about our values and sustainability, but working in the oil and gas industry.
Well, the answer to that, when you're talking about representation and getting in between, like being on the outside versus being on the inside. Yeah. Indigenous people, going back to the sort of traditional Indigenous people, the earth, all the elements of nature are related to each other. There's that interconnectedness that's so important. And so people do clash with that idea when you're representing oil and gas, which, let's be realistic, it's digging big holes in the ground and changing rivers and doing what resource extraction does. Yeah. It can be very difficult to defend that position, right? Yeah. What are you doing working for them? Yeah. They're the bad guy, they're the big oil, right? Yeah. So for me, I think it's important to be on the inside, to influence that change, to have that impact, to have a voice. Like we mentioned before, Indigenous voices are louder than they've ever been, and that's not going to change. Yeah. Resource extraction is not going anywhere in our lifetime. Yeah. So why not be on the inside where you can be part of that change and make sure that it's ethical, make sure it's as mutually beneficial as possible, make sure the consultation's being heeded, make sure that the communities are benefiting as much as they possibly can, and that they have a voice in the way it's being done. Yeah. Where as an Indigenous person, you have an opportunity to have a little bit more impact, a little bit more of a voice. Yeah. They are listening more than they ever have now, and that's an opportunity we need to jump on. Get on the inside, have that impact, have that influence, be that advisor, be that guide. Yeah. Because I really feel like this is going to go on with or without us, honestly, for the near foreseeable future. But why not be a part of it and make sure that it's in the best way possible, rather than sitting on the sidelines and complaining. Doesn't impact any kind of change. It's just going to poison you. So for myself, the reason that I'm here, the reason why I have the job that I do, is because that impacting that positive change, impacting the way people think, changing that whole culture into something more equitable and understanding of where we're at as far as economic reconciliation goes. Reconciliation as a whole, all of it, everything we've talked about today ties into that.
Yeah, that's wonderful, beautiful. And I love all those different points. I think, there's so much opportunity. One of the things I even tell young, I find that there's less of an interest from young people to get into the extractive industries. And, not just the extractive, but even with renewable, we're still extracting resources. We're extracting solar energy, we're extracting wind. But to get into a lot of that, because, before it was great paying jobs. But we really need to think about it also too as a way to influence, sustainability, innovation, and everything like that. I always tell young people, if things are really upsetting you in regards to our global footprint, our carbon footprint, and emissions and everything like that, there is likely no better way to make a change, make an impactful change, especially so early in your career, and then build a career in it as you would within the industry. Innovate, new technology, new ways of doing, because there is this idea that we are transitioning, absolutely, in terms of how we produce and electrify and everything, but we still need those resources. We'll always need a lot of those resources. We'll always be doing that extraction in some degree. So why not influence how we can do it as best as we possibly can, and as sustainably as we can? You know, some of the realities are that the global demand for energy continues to rise faster than we can deploy technologies and land bases and appropriate energy mixes and sources and things like that, and figure that stuff out. And so let's get involved in these places and influence how these organizations are doing best possible. And as Indigenous people, that aligns with our values, absolutely. And so as a young person in the extractive industries, I thought, I'm really leaning into who I am. And as I moved through my career and got to work in these, I felt it was reconciled, but again, the criticism was there, right? And so, and then you spoke well and brilliant to it. So I think that's an important thing to understand. The other thing I'd like, and it's more in line with, and it's in line with this as well too, is IRN stands up. We have an obligation to stand up when people say, there's this particular policy. Some of the more controversial policies are, with our federal government capping, emissions by effect, and then we were told that it's not a production cap, but I think a lot of the data shows and indicates that it would change production. And you talked about at IRN we talked about who's vulnerable to a lot of those changes. And so if we change production, we change investment opportunity, the first people to really feel those impacts are the Indigenous businesses and the Indigenous workers, right? And so we stand up and try to at least understand, does this policy contemplate the impact, social or the economic and the cascading social economic? If not, it should, right? And there's people who speak to those things. But and then the other one too is transition. So as we transition out, do we understand the impact of those policies? And you explain that without proper proxy, proper data. There's Indigenous people that are truly going to feel the impact of that and potentially regress. We have Indigenous workers say that we're scared shitless. We just figured out how to be a profitable organization in this industry, and we're looking well-servicing industry, and then we're told, and then we hear that we're going to have to pivot entirely. Well, that's just the way things are. And it's like, well, okay, if someone's going to propose, especially if it's a public entity, if it's going to propose something like that, then we would hope there's some obligation in terms of understanding that impact, right? But yeah, back to what I wanted to get your perspective on in regards to some of these positions. How important is it to, I guess, lean into those values, to lean into the understanding the impact, to depoliticize this conversation, and to use your voice, right?
Making sure that we're still equitable as we evolve, making sure we're still equitable in policy, government, and all the way down to individual corporations. But what I see happening, especially in resources, is there's more equity agreements, there's more partnerships, there's more profit sharing, all these mutually beneficial, long-term, which is what we want, right? So when we start limiting the resource industry and we start capping things and we start changing direction, people that have worked very hard to become an equal partner, and communities that have worked very hard to have that, that partnership, it impacts them as well. Yes, 100% it does. And I feel like the way that we're going in the industry, there's going to be more and more of these agreements. There's going to be more and more equity, more and more profit sharing, where you're not just going after the corporations anymore. You may be inadvertently, as it may be, you might be going after communities and individuals with businesses, and everybody's impacted. Everyone has a share in that, right? So I think that definitely needs to be considered when we start looking at legislation and changes to things and the energy transition and all of that, because the more and more Indigenous business and Indigenous people and communities we have as partners, the more say they should have in what happens to them, their business, their interests. Again, we come back to the consultation and the listening piece, and what do people want, and how can we do it responsibly. And we've had industry change communities for the better. We've had industry change communities for the worse, let's be honest, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
But they need to have a say in it as well.
Yeah.
And they've, like you mentioned, they work very hard to get to a point where they're successful and they have a successful business in whatever capacity that might be related to resource. It could be devastating to rein that in or cap that off or change the direction. It's not as easy for a small business to pivot as it might be for a large corporation. So I really think, again, consideration needs to be given and really look at the impacts of things all the way down the chain.
Yeah. Like that's, you know.
I hope that was your question.
No, it does. Absolutely. It absolutely certainly was. You know, and I admire some of the incredible challenges that, you know, the government has in terms of contemplating, you know, and aligning these goals and to moving us as a responsible nation forward. But again, equally challenged in terms of ensuring that we get, you know, we hear those voices and then we include them and contemplate them in policy design. I know, you know, things that we really struggle with, Indigenous people struggle with, you know, generalizing here, but with Ireland we try to stand up and speak is far often, again, nothing about us without us, right? Things, you know, policy from its development through, you know, through its design, development, ideation, and then, you know, right into its implementation. You know, the representation matters, right? And
that's exactly the statement that should cover it all. You know, nothing about us without us. Because let's be honest, you know, non-Indigenous people have been sitting around deciding what's best for Indigenous people since the beginning. And that's still unfortunately true today for in many cases. And again, that's why it's important for the voices to be on the inside. That's why it's important for us to have influence from the inside. You know, boardrooms full of people that don't know what they don't know are making decisions that are steering the fate of our communities and our people. They need those Indigenous voices in the room. And I just, that sums it up, you know, nothing about us without us. And that's, if you follow that rule in all of your consulting and your development, you're on the right track, right? I think it's a good rule, and take it to heart, right?
Yeah, like, absolutely. And that's probably a really good segue, and something that's really I really struggle with. You see a lot of polarized and sensationalized activism that's happening out there. There's a lot of pissed off people, and you know, and Indigenous people are brought in, and there's a lot of things that, you know, I think Indigenous people are probably rightfully so in terms of being really upset with and being generally pissed off. You know, how that manifests and how you do something about it is you know, I guess, you know, different strokes for different folks. And we try to encourage practical, pragmatic discourse, working together, you know, things that could frustrate, you know, people within our network, organizations, and Indigenous workers in business. But again, you know, that voice, that sensationalization is really frustrating. And so, you know, what is your perspective on, you know, again, that type of activism being the voice for Indigenous people as it relates to resource development?
I think it's like anything else. You can't just take one small group's opinion and make that the voice, right? And we were talking about this morning. We basically did this whole interview before we started this morning. But
this is take
like
two.
indigenization, right?
Indigenization,
so how do you do that?
You
can't just ask your one, you know, diversity hire Indigenous person, because that's one person from one group of Indigenous people that had one experience of life. It's no different in this way, that you can't ask one sensationalized group, what do Indigenous people think of development? Because you're going to get different opinions from different communities, different individuals within those communities, different bands, all the coast to coast. You're probably not going to get the same answer. So I don't think anybody deserves to be the voice of what Indigenous people want, for better or worse, or in whatever subject we're discussing. There's no one group or one community or one person that can speak for everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really important. You know, I think we were asked one time, you know, in regards to, you know, treatment of some of these groups, and like treat them like any other group. Treat them with dignity. We have some compassion in terms of them being understand their frustrations, but at the same time also we need to give credence to, you know, the depth of those voices as well too, and those people are participating at all levels of resource development, through the supply side and internal. I think that's incredibly important. You know, what would we say to people who are contemplating or struggling with getting involved meaningfully in resource development in the oil and gas industry?
Yeah.
And so what would you say to them?
Well, you mentioned this earlier about young people not being as attracted as they once were, right? And I think that ties back to reputation. It ties back to how responsibly we are handling consultation and, you know, how it's benefiting communities. All of those things matter when you're looking at jobs, right? And it goes, the whole conversation's connected in a way that you have to understand that who you're going to work for is doing the best that they can with what they know, you know, and maybe you want to be part of that. I would say, you know, young people that are contemplating exactly some of the things I've already said, I guess, it's just that to be the change from the inside gives you so much more influence and impact. We have a time now that we've never had before in history to be listened to and to be considered, and I think that's only going to continue to increase as time goes on. I really do believe that. And it better to be a part of it and make it as best as it can to bring that Indigenous voice to the table. You have to realize so many of these people, we talked about this, heads of company, the leaders of these companies, they don't know what they don't know. Very well educated people, insanely smart, running multi-million-dollar companies, but in the Indigenous spaces, that's something that, you know, you need to be mentored on often. At that level, I find, you know, it helps to have those voices in the room. So think of yourself as part of the cure. You're going to change it for the better. You're going to leave a legacy behind, like Lana, who's integrated this reclamation with the community members. That's going to live long after us. And you know, creating things like that in industry that maybe it will become standard practice one day, like that's incredible. That wouldn't have happened without an Indigenous person there to put that idea forward. So think of it in those terms as what difference can I make? How can I positively impact and change this? Because it's not, it's a big machine. It's not going to stop no matter what you choose to do. So for people that might be contemplating it or have an education or an interest or something that can get them into the industry, you know, there's a great opportunity to make change in a good way, to bring that conscience to a corporation that maybe they didn't have before. So
that's incredible. And you know, I think one of the things, and it's really important to probably leave it at this point, because, and wrap it up at this point, because we talk about, you know, being involved in this industry and being involved meaningfully, and seeing it as a good opportunity, seeing Indigenous people lead that way. These actions, and as I hear you, like with compassion and passion and sincerity and authenticity, this is not marketing. This is not, you know, and this is certainly not a group or a division or a department, and it's certainly not Indigenous people doing something just for the sake of business. This is Indigenous people living their values, and that manifesting and being operationalized within an organization, within resource development, and that's super important to hear, because far too often I get frustrated with being criticized. I know who I am, I know my values, and I know integrity, and it's really important we celebrate that as people. You know, we're not compromising, we're moving things forward, we're being practical, we're being resourceful, we're being useful, you know, I think in moving these things along. So that's wonderful, and you said it incredible. Well, thank you very much.
Well, thank you.
Absolutely, it's my absolute pleasure. Well, that was a wonderful way to spend a beautiful, brisk morning here in downtown Calgary, talking with Amanda Robert, and here and in the head offices of Suncor, in a wonderful room dedicated to celebrating and practicing Indigenous ceremonies. So absolutely excited to be here. So thank you very much, Amanda, for joining us today on our engagement and with the Indigenous Voices podcast. It's really important that we celebrate and share all the incredible good things that are happening across resource development as they are with Indigenous people. So thank you very much for that. And I'm going to give the last word to you.
I just really appreciate you thinking of me to come and have a visit this morning and have a chat. And you've definitely given me more food for thought around my work and myself and, just the whole path forward for everybody. So I appreciate the insights and the conversation, and thanks for having me.
Indigenous kinship and reciprocity in action. I love it. No, thank you very much.
Hi, my name's Amanda Robert. I'm a senior advisor in the Indigenous and Community Relations Group in Resource Development. I'm a proud Métis woman, and I'm proud to be part of the Indigenous Resource Network.